On today's episode of the Old Souls Football Podcast, we're joined by Aaron Schatz of FTN. Aaron has been an expert on NFL analytics for over 2 decades. He's the creator of the DVOA, DYAR, and adjusted line yards tools. All of these metrics are used to not only give us an unbiased picture of today's best NFL teams, but they also provide context for NFL history dating back to 1978. Aaron is also one of the 50 voting members of the Associated Press's NFL MVP and All-Pro teams. You can find all of his current work at ftnfantasy.com.
All right, welcome into this week's episode of the Old Souls Football Podcast. We're back after a little hiatus after our back-to-back live shows from the draft. Hopefully you guys enjoyed those. This week, we are back to kind of normal shows, and we have a guest on the show today. Aaron Schatz, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
For anyone who doesn't know, and I think with our audience being old souls, I don't know how many people are aware, but if we have younger audience members out there, they definitely would know who Aaron is. Aaron's been working in NFL data analytics for well over 2 decades. He's created a lot of well-known statistics like DVOA, DER, and then just to name a few, adjusted line yards as well. But those are just a couple of many. Aaron, one of the things I wanted to get into, Stephen was like, Neil, I'll let you kind of take the reins for this. I'm a math teacher, so I love data. Actually, both of my student or groups of students, I teach an advanced course and I teach like a gen ed. I'm a 6th grade math teacher, and we're working in statistics right now. So it's like one of my favorite parts of the year. How did your early years of not just football fandom, but your professional work lead you to wanting to work with, and then like maybe eventually create advanced statistics in football?
They didn't.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's funny is it didn't. I mean, it did really have nothing to do with each other. I was a radio disc jockey
Oh,
out of college, and then I did market research for a while, and I did music journalism for a little bit. And no, this was all a side project. I was an economics major in college, so I had some knowledge of statistics that way, and I sort of taught myself some more than, and then just sort of started this based on being a football fan. Started playing with stats back in 2002. It wasn't really related to my job in any way. It just was it's a side hustle.
did you see something while you were watching football or while you were using the internet in its early days or reading through the paper the day after on a Monday morning? Did you see something that you were like, yeah, that's just not right? Like, why are we glorifying this stat? Or why are we glorifying this way of playing ball when we should be looking at this? How did that?
Yeah, I didn't understand why certain writers glorified the idea of establishing the run when teams that didn't run as much were pretty successful.
Yeah.
The Oakland Raiders of the 2001, 2002 Oakland Raiders are the best example for me. Is that this is a team that was really successful with Charlie Garner as the main running back, right? So
Mhm.
I was like, well, Bill James got his start in baseball analytics by just counting stolen bases out of box scores. I'm going to go do the same thing with football. So I counted up all the runs in the first quarter and went to see whether that had any correlation to winning. And it didn't. It turned out that establishing the run meant nothing. That what you did was you racked up rushes and rushing yardage in the fourth quarter when you already held a lead. And
Right.
that was the start of my football analytics.
Interesting.
So you mean to tell me Arthur Smith was wrong this entire time when he was coaching the Falcons?
I mean, a lot of people still believe in the concept of establishing
Yeah.
the, and it doesn't, I mean, you don't want to pass 100% of the time,
Yeah.
but you don't need to run early in games in order to establish that you are willing to do it. The run was established when you were 7 years old.
Yeah.
It was established in Pop Warner. Right? Like one of the ideas behind establishing the run is that you have to force linebackers to respect the run for your play fakes to work.
Mhm.
Linebackers learned to respect the run when they were 10, right? Like that
Yeah.
hasn't, their first step is still forward.
Yeah.
When you make that fake, it doesn't matter how many times you run the ball in that game, the instinct is still there.
Yeah.
That's the truth. Yeah, I always laugh at I'm based in Chicago, so Dave Wanstedt, who had a very mediocre at best career. I mean, like he's still had a really good assistant coaching career, but head coaching career mediocre at best. But he somehow found a niche in the Chicago media pocket, and he will almost always like there's a few things that he'll say, but he'll always start with, guys, you have to run the ball. When I took over as the head coach of the Chicago Bears in 93, Bill Parcells told me, Dave, you got to run the ball.
I mean, listen, first of all, for a lot of these guys, it's because they're still stuck in the 70s and it was a different
Yes.
game then. And also, the lower down you go in levels in football, the more important the running game is.
Right.
Right. So just because something works in high schools and colleges doesn't mean it works in the pros. And I'm not even sure it works in colleges at this point.
No, I don't think
It,
so.
it's because the quarterback play is so good in college now to where it was even
Right.
20 years ago.
Yeah. And so the NFL obviously is to even farther in that direction. The pass is just much more efficient than the run. But also just running the ball doesn't, like, the body blows concept that you wear down a defense with runs and then suddenly
Mhm.
in the fourth quarter they're giving you lots of yardage is not true. It's just not true.
Right. So with that, a good transition would be, as I mentioned earlier, Aaron created DVOA and DR. So Aaron, or DYAR, um, Aaron, I mean, I know what it is. I know what they are. Steven, I think, has a good idea what they are. Um, but could you explain for our viewers that are like, what is this?
Yes. Here's the basic definition. DVOA assigns success to every play based on the down and distance, and then compares it to a league average baseline, which is adjusted for situation and opponent.
Perfect.
DYAR then takes that and turns it into a total stat rather than a rate stat. So it's total value rather than value per play.
Okay. That's very simple. So, hopefully our viewers are able to get that. I've always been able to understand it. But it's always been very interesting to me. Because I often used to, well, in my early days of kind of learning about them, I used to, um, I used to wonder, like, is it, like what the correlation between the two of them were. But as I got older, I started to realize that DYAR was more like your old typical volume stat, even though
Yeah.
it's still analytical in its
Because it
infancy.
compares things to replacement level instead of average. A player who carries the ball a lot but is average will still have value because
Yes,
he's playing instead of a backup.
exactly.
Obviously, every backup is different, and sometimes the backup's better than the starter. But this is, sort of comparing to the league average backup.
League average replacement level.
Yeah.
I always get in arguments with my friends about like the value of a quarterback in a fantasy league, right? So Lamar Jackson only playing 14 games, but scoring, 7, 8 points more than the average quarterback is more valuable than you getting 1 or 2 more points than the average quarterback on a weekly basis for
Yeah, it's sort of
17
similar
games.
right. It's sort of similar in
Yeah.
some ways to, like, yeah, why quarterbacks go lower in fantasy drafts, because the top running backs compared to the replacement level running back of fantasy gets more points than the top quarterback compared to the replacement level quarterback of fantasy if you're in a league that only has one quarterback per team, because then you only have like 12 quarterbacks and they're all good.
Yep.
Um, what are some misconceptions people make about DVOA or the other statistics that you've created? And then if I could rephrase it another way, what are misconceptions people make watching football that DVOA and the such dispel?
Well, I mean, as far as misconceptions about DVOA, people who are fans of the stat do tend to rely on it sometimes a little bit too much rather than
Mhm.
looking at the context of like a player's teammates or the scheme that he plays in. The opposite of that is people who don't like analytics. It's not something with DVOA, it's that they have this image that I like don't watch football. Right,
Yeah.
that stat guys don't watch. If only you watched football, do you understand how much football I watch? Honestly, like I watch a ridiculous amount of
I
NFL
wish I
football.
had your job, but in some
Like I
ways I
don't
wish I
watch
didn't.
college because I watch so much NFL football. I need time to do other things. So, um, but like, you know, uh, I wouldn't say there's like broad misconceptions that DVOA disproves. There's a lot of stuff that analytics has worked on over the last 20 years. And of course, DVOA helps to do things like adjust for luck and adjust for um, opponent strength. And I think one thing we've definitely shown is turnovers are less predictive than yards and first downs. Turnovers are hugely important, but they're less predictive of how you're going to play in the future. So teams that are overly dependent on turnovers, like defenses that are overly dependent on turnovers, don't tend to play as well in the future as defenses that are really good at just shutting down the yardage.
Like I said, I'm from Chicago. Steven's from South Carolina, but he's a Packers fan. And I remember arguing with him going into the 2019 season opener, where I was like, with Steven was like, yeah, it's going to be hard for the Bears to replicate that luck they had on defense last year. And I was like, well, Lovey's defenses did it. Like, why can't this defense do
I
it?
know that Lovey Smith, the big one is not just turnovers, but fumble recoveries,
Yeah.
right? The idea, so causing fumbles, there is something to the idea that some teams will cause more fumbles than other teams. But fumble recovery is essentially random, and Lovey Smith does not have special powers that allow his team to recover a higher percentage of fumbles. Fumble recovery varies widely from year to year.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying that. The next thing I was going to bring up, what was the reception of DVOA in its early years? Like for instance, like when it came out, it was 2002 about, right? Didn't you say
2003 was when I
2003?
launched my old website, and
Okay.
we got a lot of attention right away. And then the growth after that was very slow. Like the people that were going to be into this found it early. I did a
Yes.
good job of promoting myself. And
I
then growth after that was slow.
I because the way I got it, like, because I would have been like 7 going on 8 going into that 2003 season.
Yeah, I'm old.
And
It's yeah.
when my mom finally got NFL Network, I think when I was in the 2008 season. And so I started watching, I watched every single NFL top 10 show. And that's how I learned about who you were. And because I was like, it would say Aaron Schatz and then Football Outsiders. And I'd be like, okay, let me look this guy up. And that's how I got into it. So did that, like, because you were getting TV time, did that launch the
Everything
website?
helps. I mean, we got a lot of attention in 2003 from readers of Greg Easterbrook because we hosted his column for a couple weeks, and then readers of Peter King because we did a write a Peter King column contest.
Hmm.
So that got us a lot of attention from Peter King readers. And that's a lot of where our initial readership came from. And then I tried to spread the word about our site to baseball analytics people. Hey, life doesn't end on November 1st. Come read about this other sport. And that's where a
Right.
lot of our initial readership came from. And then the growth was slow after that. But doing the TV shows definitely helped, whether it's NFL Top 10 or the year that I did a Numbers Never Lie on ESPN in 2011, where I was actually on a show every Tuesday and Wednesday.
Oh, yeah, I remember that show.
Mm.
Um, When so this year or just was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think just before the draft, you released your 1979 and 1980 DVOAs. So I always make sure I carve out some time to sit down and read those.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania seemed like they were well, we knew that Pittsburgh, of course, was the king of the 70s, but in Philadelphia then took over in the early 80s. Were there any wonky or unusual occurrences during those seasons that
I
caught
love
your eye?
doing the old years. They're lots of fun. This is before I watched football, so I don't remember them at all. So
Yes.
I'm always learning things. So, I mean, it depends how wonky, I mean, it depends what you think of as wonky, I think. Um,
Guys that you thought were bad.
I didn't know how good Atlanta was in 1980, for example. I didn't
Oh
know that the
yeah.
Patriots were pretty good in 1980.
The Patriots had an incredible running game, didn't they?
Not, sorry, not, yeah, 1980 was when they were really good. Um, the, what was I going to say? Earl Campbell, like you don't realize quite how good Earl Campbell was. Like two of the 5 or 6 best rushing seasons by our numbers ever. Earl Campbell in 1979 and 1980.
Wow.
I don't think people now necessarily realize how good Dan Fouts was.
Mm-hmm.
Like really just beyond the rest of the league in his ability to play quarterback back in those years.
We had Mark Steven, what was his last name? Your mic's off.
Sorry, I had myself muted because I was doing a little research. But we had Mark Oristano on, and we were talking. He was mostly talking about the Steelers and the Cowboys because we were doing like a Super Bowl 13 episode.
He served in Dallas, so he was kind of he did pre and post game and halftime shows for the Cowboys in the 70s, and then they brought him back in the 90s. But he went to Houston in like 1979 and was there for 4 or 5 years. So he had said that he was there the night on Monday Night Football when Earl Campbell dropped his head and bulldozed it was an LA Rams linebacker, I think it was. But he had said that it was the most incredible thing he had ever seen in his life. That it was like superhuman that he felt that.
Everybody has that one play. For me and a lot of people of my generation, it was Bo Jackson on Monday Night Football running into the tunnel.
Oh yeah, yeah, that was insane. I don't know what would be my play. I'd have to go back to like my infancy years to think about what was.
Mine are usually unpopular, but I'll always remember
He did
just
what?
the he did what catch as a Packer fan, the Antonio Freeman.
Yes.
But I would say my number one though would be like I've been a fan since about 99. So basically my entire life I've been a football fan. But Marshawn Lynch 2010, the
Oh, the
Beastquake.
Beastquake. Yeah.
Yes,
Like
that was
that was one
incredible.
of those plays that just it always sticks in my mind. And uh it that was always and it's
People
funny
talk
though.
about remembering where they were when certain plays happened, but for me, a lot of plays in the playoffs, the answer to where was I is the Gillette Stadium press box, and that actually is where I was watching Beastquake too.
Oh, really?
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, that's cool.
So what challenges I'm sure obviously there's many at this point, especially the further you go back in time. But what challenges are you running into, and how far back do you think you'll be able to go with DVOA?
I mean, challenges that I'm running with into doing the past, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, because there's a certain point where people just didn't own VCRs, right? Like there's certain teams that have not been good about keeping their game books through history, like the
Mhm.
Bengals. And then there's a certain point where people didn't own VCRs, and certain markets are bigger than others. So it's easier to find Giants games than games by, for example, the Bengals.
Yeah.
So 1980 is the first year where we have a game we just can't find.
Ooh.
We have a game in 1980 between the Chargers and the Bengals that, from what we can tell, there is no video evidence or actual complete game book of this game. Like we
And there's
cannot find
probably
it.
nobody to claim that they were even there. And that would
I mean,
have been a great
there's about a 10-minute highlight film on YouTube of this game, but that's it.
and that would have been the
Uh,
preview of the next year's AFC title game.
yep. I mean, yeah. So 78, we're gonna get 78. I
Okay.
don't know how much farther back we can go before that. And 78 is a very convenient starting point because 78 is the year they went to 16 games. 78 is the year they liberalized passing rules.
Yes.
78 is really the start of the modern NFL as we know
Yeah.
it today. So 78 is really a logical starting point to not, we'll play around with before that, but the 78 is a logical starting.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I know somebody, I think a reader years ago did like estimated DVOA one time, and
Yes, did all the
that
way back into the 40s and 50s. That was
would
fun. We need to redo it at some point because the formula has changed a bit since then, and so the
okay.
estimations would change a bit. Yeah.
So yeah, that would be fun, a fun project to look into. But that was I think that's a really cool idea actually, because that
Yeah,
was
it's funny thinking of the Steelers. 76 may have been the best Steelers regular season.
when they started 0-4, and
No, that's not. 76 is where the defense gave up like single digits in
but
like every game. But
didn't
then
they start like 0-4 and then they won
did
like 10
they?
in a row?
I just, the Raiders, won it all that year, but
Mhm.
that defense was unbelievable in
Yes.
76. Like, and
I think they would have had a good chance against the Steelers in the AFC title, but I think they were playing without Franco and
it's just
Frenchy
a good
Fuqua.
example of the fact that NFL history is filled with teams that won it all, not in the best year, not in the best year of the regular season.
Yeah.
I think the 78 Steelers are the team. I want to say that they didn't they was it they didn't give up a first half touchdown for like the
First
entire
quarter
first quarter touchdown like the
until
entire
the
season.
Cowboys scored in the
Yeah.
Super Bowl.
Yeah, because when we did an episode on that, that was like one of the big talking points is that that was the end of the dead ball era, and like they had the Mel Blunt rule, but it didn't really matter because the Steelers arguably had their best defense despite the rule
Yeah,
changes. That's
things
how great they
changed in
were.
78, but it took a couple years. Like
Yep.
things did not suddenly turn in 78 with the rule changes. Like the moving towards more passing and stuff took a couple of years.
One question I had is like because you brought up the dead ball era, like the end of that, and like with 78, and it kind of transitioned more into passing. One of the things that I wrote down is like if you were to go back, to before 78 and even back into the 60s, like in terms of total DVOA, like, and you can kind of explain to our listeners, like, because one thing we look at in today's game is the passing game is more valuable to team
Yeah,
success
it's
than the run
interesting. I
game.
don't know whether perhaps the running game would become more important than the passing game. It
Yeah.
would be interesting to see if you go back
Yeah.
into the mid 70s what it would come in. Now every year works that it's averaged at 0,
Okay.
right?
Yep.
So the ratings wouldn't be higher than they are today, but it's interesting if rushing would be higher than passing, whereas every year now, passing is higher than rushing.
Yeah, because the like you said earlier in the episode, I mean the quarterback skill. There's more receivers now. The college game is producing. Basically, they're just passing game factories at this point. We're getting 8, 9, 10 quality receivers in every draft. It feels like we had 6 quarterbacks go in the top 12 just a couple weeks ago. So, like, because I was looking when we did an episode on like Lombardi going to the Redskins and like his whole career, but like you actually go back and look at like Bart Starr and Sonny Jurgensen when Lombardi took over in
Or,
Washington, like their career
or those
stats aren't.
Giants passing attacks in the early
Yeah,
60s were very good with Y.A. Tittle.
yeah, but
That's
they
why some
weren't.
things like the fact that Norm Van Brocklin still holds the record for passing yards in a game is insane.
Yeah,
Yeah.
The
The
fact
fact
that
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 Sid
record has
Luckman threw
not been
7
beaten
touchdowns.
by anybody in the modern NFL is kind of nuts.
Yeah, it is wild. You know, well, and even that's a different path. I wonder what their route trees were like back then. Like, were their
I mean,
route?
that is like the equivalent of like a 700-yard game today or something. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so far beyond anything else from that era. Those Rams offenses with Van Brocklin were like way beyond.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the other thing about football is the further back you get, the more difference there is between the best and worst teams because strategies were not standardized across the league. You
Mm-hmm.
get into the 40s and it's just a different game than it is today. And some teams are running like the T formation, whereas other teams are running something more modern. And then you have the A formation. Like football really developed gradually, and you can't really compare the distant past to modern times the way you can with baseball.
Right. It looks
Like
so
baseball, if
different.
you adjust for era, you can compare players today to players from the 20s. You cannot. Football, was just so completely different.
Yeah, that's true.
And really, that's true all the way up into the 60s. I
Yeah,
mean,
That's always
the 60 is a good place to start history because it's the start of the AFL, and 78 is a good place to start history, or 67. But certainly, like the 50s, it's just a very different sport.
yeah. I've always made the argument like, and maybe I'm just a biased Packer fan, but when you're listing the top 10 receivers of all time, like you have to start talking about Don Hudson. A lot of modern fans have no idea who that is because I mean the guy played in the
Right. His numbers
1930s.
look modern, and everybody else's numbers look like they're from 1943.
Yeah, and that's always my argument because like not he's not in the top 100 anymore, but like he's just outside the top 100 all time in receiving yards. But he played in an era where like the forward pass
he's
was a
playing a
foreign
different
concept.
sport than he's playing a different sport than everyone else. Yeah.
Yeah,
really.
The same is
I,
true of Sammy Baugh and Sid Luckman compared to
yep.
other quarterbacks of the time. Sammy Baugh and Sid Luckman are just playing a different sport than everyone else.
Do you think like so does the Don Hudson examples with like how valuable and you mentioned Sig Luckman and those like in terms of how they revolutionized the passing game. Like somebody like Derrick Henry, for example, like that runs for two because that's the team that's like the last 3, 4, 5 years, right? He's the only guy that comes close to 2,000 rushing yards in a given season, right?
Yeah.
Like how do I know that like running the ball and like a common conversation we talk about it doesn't really deliver a lot of added value compared to passing. Are there special circumstances for a player like that is so far above the average producer at the
He's
position,
not
or
so far above the average producer.
he's not? Okay.
No, he's not. I mean, a little bit more in volume, but
Yeah.
not in efficiency.
Yep.
Henry is not that special in efficiency. Nick Chubb is more special.
Yep.
Because now that we have the chips in the pads and we have the player tracking, you can do stuff like rush yards over expectation, where you look at where the blockers are at the moment of the handoff and how many yards you would expect, and then how many yards a running back actually gets. And the champion in that is always Nick Chubb.
That makes sense but he doesn't always get the quantity of the carries that somebody like Derrick Henry does.
And he was injured all of last year.
And he was injured all of last year.
So like the way you look at rushing efficiency, it's just like the game has changed so much because the best runners aren't even getting the most attempts. But if you go back into the 70s and 80s, they were all workhorse backs basically. I mean,
they weren't. Not in the 70s. No, in the 70s, it was much more of a committee system.
Platoon. Yeah.
A
lot of the guys.
It's not until you get into the mid 80s that you have the workhorse. The era of the workhorse back goes from about 84 to like 2004. Right? Where one guy got all the carries, starting with like Campbell and Eric Dickerson. I mean, a little bit before 84, you'd have Campbell and George Rogers and Billy Sims. And that was the start of that. But still in the 70s, you had a lot of like the Miami Dolphins, right? Like you had a lot
that's
of
true.
Those running back by committee situations where they had the change up and the key breaker and the fullback. And
when you're doing your research, is there anything you look back on and think, like, us being the old souls, like, there's few things that like we love the modern game, and like we obviously our podcast still focuses on the modern game, but there's tidbits that we think back on like, man, I wish that was still part of the game. Like obviously the commercialization of the game was always going to happen, but is there anything when you do your research that you say, I kind of wish that was still in the NFL today?
Not really. I mean, I enjoy and learn a lot, enjoy all the old stuff, and it's fun seeing the really big old pads.
Yes.
But there's nothing where I'm like, oh man, if only we brought back kickers who sucked all the time, or if we only brought back the near and far formations and more split backs, or we didn't wide receivers starting in 3-point stances. Like
Yeah, that
I
always
don't
pisses me off.
miss any of those things. I think football's at its best today.
Yeah.
Nothing against there's greatness of the past and it's fun, but there's nothing that I miss, and I'm like, oh, I wish. I mean, certain uniform combinations.
Yeah.
You probably. I don't have a soft spot for the Tampa Bay creamsicles, but I know some people do.
Nor have I.
Um, and I love the San Francisco 1994 uniforms, and
Really?
some people want the Oilers back. Stuff like that.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, no, there's a few uniform things that I've always, me and I mean, I always think people wish that the NFL would look like it did when they were 10. That's probably me. I
That's
wish
what
that
it usually is. I mean, the people that want the 70s football back all grew up in the 70s for the most part.
Yeah.
And then I love football from the late 90s, early 2000s. But I agree with you.
You don't have a soft spot probably for the red Patriots uniforms, because when you started watching the Patriots, they were already wearing flying Elvis.
Yes. Yeah, they
right?
were.
So to you, that's just how the Patriots are supposed to look, or the Broncos, right?
Oh,
if you
God.
started really getting into things in 98, 99, you remember your memory of Broncos uniforms is with the horse head on the helmet and
the dark blue,
the dark blue with the orange curvy thingy that looks like a Nike symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas people who grew up in the 70s are like, bring back the orange crush, bring back the D on the helmet, right? Like, I mean, you get used to what it was like when you were growing up.
My first year of watching football, the quarterback for the Broncos actually wasn't even Elway. I think it was Bubby Brister.
He played like half the year in 98. It was pretty good, yeah.
Yeah. So then, but he
was the backup, and Elway was hurt for like 6 games.
Yeah, and then I think Greasy was there,
and then Greasy took over after Elway retired.
Yeah. So but I agree with you. Like it seems that the quality of the game today, I think, people there's certain things but I also think with the way the passing game is emphasized, I think with player safety, I agree with the player safety moves.
I mean, if there was anything, it would be to change. The problem is it would be to change some of the rules to give defense a little bit of a leg up
chance
compared to offense. But the fact is, all those rules have been put into place primarily for safety purposes, not so offense does whatever it wants.
Yes.
Most of those rules are safety related rules, and it just so happens that safety related rules favor offense because they are not good for hitting.
Yep.
And so I'm not if there was a way to bring back the ability to smack a receiver over the middle without actually hurting him and just doing the football like a
little love tap,
smacking a receiver over the middle.
Yeah.
I would love to bring that back but that's not how human bodies work.
Yeah.
It's not practical.
So no.
I've always wondered, maybe do you get rid of illegal contact? Do you?
I mean, yeah. My thoughts on rules are mostly not. Let's go back to the way it used to be. My thoughts on rules are mostly, changes about a 5-yard roughing the passer, so that there's 5 and 15-yard roughing the passer, so that roughing the passer, when you have that ridiculous body weight on the quarterback thing, it doesn't hurt the defense that much. I mean, my one go back into the past rule change would be to get rid of all illegal celebration rules.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But that's not really going back to the 70s. That's going back to the 2000s.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think, or go ahead, Neil. Sorry.
No, the one thing, even just besides rules that I've been on this, I've been texting Steven about this. It's been kind of in the news. I know Mike Florio has been talking about the schedule release a lot lately and how it's usually tomorrow, right? The last.
Oh, it changes every year.
It changes all the time. But one of the things that really annoys me now about the NFL And I get it because they want to increase as much viewership. They want to increase the opportunities for people to bet. But I hate the amount of island games that there are nowadays.
Oh, yeah. It's tiring if you do this for a living. The
Yeah.
weeks there's a 9:30 a.m. European game.
Yeah.
4 in a row is hard. I
Yeah.
love football, but 4 in a row is hard.
Yeah.
Paying
You want to be
attention
able to
to it.
sleep in and get yourself prepared for Sunday at noon or 1.
Not to
Or
mention that
just
it's 6:30 for people on the West Coast. That's just
Yeah.
not fair.
yeah, or you see like, or you would love to see your family members because if you're
But I hate
working
to tell you,
all the
there's no
yeah.
going back.
Oh, no. It's only going to get
The
worse.
Wednesday Christmas games this year are the
That's going to
ultimate
be,
sign that there is no going back.
yeah.
Yeah. And
It-
they're going to push for 18 at some point. I mean, it's already
We're
started.
going to
really.
18 the next time the CBA is negotiated.
Yeah.
So that
And
probably is not until 2030, I think. But there's no question the next time the CBA comes up, the league is going to make them do 18 games. They're going to go to 18 games with 2 byes, and the Super Bowl will be played on President's Day weekend, so everybody gets Monday off.
that I'm okay with. That I'm okay with having Monday. I've been saying that for like, especially when they went to 17 games, and I was like, I mean, President's Day is just next weekend. I have it off already since I'm a teacher. I would just kind of like if they pushed it. And I
Yeah.
guess that would mean week 1 would be Labor Day, which that me and Steven have talked about. They could rule Labor Day weekend.
Yeah.
If they did that. And I guess they used to do that for years.
Yeah, then they gave that to college, but they don't give anything to college anymore.
No, they might as well take it back. The football almanac is not too far away. When's your release, or do you guys know, like sometime
We're
in July?
shooting for July 12th, Friday,
Okay.
July 12th. Everybody's working on it right now. I've done all the tables and everything. I've done my initial projections. So, yeah, we are hard at work at the is now called the FTN Football Almanac. So FTN
Perfect.
Football Almanac 2024.
Any interesting tidbits or like teams that you might surprise as a contender or vice versa? That
Atlanta's not as high as people think they are.
okay, yeah, I think I could. I think their
You
schedule
just
will
can't trust a
benefit them.
39-year-old or whatever Cousins is coming back from an Achilles injury to be that good, and their defense is bad.
Yeah, well, I know everybody was talking up how, like I remember when Justin Fields had his 300-yard performance this year, against Atlanta, and people were like, they're a top 10 defense, and I was like, top 10 in scoring, but like by DVOA, I think they were like 20th or something like that. Yeah.
They have no pass rush. They're bad. They have good corner. They have interesting, Terrell and this kid, Clark Phillips. I'm working on the top 25 under the radar prospects list, and Clark Phillips has got good reviews coming out of college. He had good numbers last year in coverage. He's good, but they have no pass rush whatsoever.
One thing I was going to ask is because one talking point, and I think I sort of agree with it. I think everything revolves around the passing game in general, just like you were talking about. But like one thing I always hear around draft season, and we really saw it this year because it was the first 12 picks I think were offensive players in the NFL draft. Like, do you see is offense more important than defense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be like this every year. Next year, a couple of the top prospects there just was no edge
It was a
rusher.
bad defensive year. Yeah.
Like edge rusher, there were no edge rushers that were top 10 guys. Like it just was no cornerbacks were top 10 guys. It just was not a good year for defensive players. But yes, offense is more important than defense, and offense is more predictable than defense, and the range of offense is wider than the range of defense. In other words, the best offenses are more important than the best defenses, and the worst offenses are more important than the worst defenses. Important in a bad way.
Yeah, that makes sense because I mean, you see it like I think it was like last year or a couple years ago.
No defense sucks as badly as the Carolina offense sucked last year.
Yeah.
And no offense is as good as the San Francisco, and no defense is as good as the San Francisco offense was last year.
Oh yeah, and yeah, because I sort of agree with that, and then especially because a lot of defenses like not your metrics or anything, but like when people talk about like total defensive performance and they're just a casual conversation, the first thing they'll bring up is like, well, they had this many interceptions or fumble recoveries, and I've been saying this ever since I've been reading a lot of your stuff and just kind of understanding like common sense is turnovers aren't predictive. And I know this as a Packer fan just from experience because in 2010 we had one of the league's best defenses, but a lot of it was turnover driven. It helps having Charles Woodson on your team that kind of helps to have that. But in 2011 we had like one of the worst defenses in history, and it was almost all the same players, same defensive coordinator, but we didn't get as many turnovers.
Defense is just is less predictive and harder to.
Yeah. So the one going away question, because and I agree with you on this.
Yeah, so do I. Yeah, I was in your corner.
Yeah, because I think he's the best player in football, and has been the last couple of years. Is Josh Allen? You voted him for MVP. Can you give us kind of your reasoning behind that?
Yeah. Every step. First of all, I think Patrick Mahomes is the best player in football. He just had an off year this year. Every stat, every advanced metric, both mine and those of my competitors, right? Because I did not only trust my own stuff, I looked at all my competitors and their advanced metric, had Josh Allen as better than Lamar Jackson. Now, most of them also had Dak Prescott as better than Lamar Jackson. Most of them also had Brock Purdy as better than Lamar Jackson. Now, Purdy is an interesting discussion because with Purdy, you get into this discussion of the 49ers scheme and like, look at what Jimmy Garoppolo did in that same scheme. And that's why I couldn't vote for Brock Purdy as the MVP. But Allen and Prescott were better than Lamar Jackson in pretty much every number. And if your argument is the eye test and look at the amazing things that Lamar Jackson does, just look with your eyes. Maybe your eyes haven't watched Josh Allen. Right? Can you imagine this statement. You stat people clearly don't watch any football. Look at the amazing thing Lamar Jackson does, whereas Josh Allen is totally boring and a game manager.
Yeah, right.
Right? I don't think I'm the one who doesn't watch football.
Yeah.
So,
To me, Josh Allen was starting to get used at the end of the season, like just like Jalen Hurts gets used in Philly's offense, where they were using him like on tush pushes and third and
he
shorts.
runs. The other thing, those interceptions, he threw a lot of interceptions. A lot of them were far downfield.
Yes.
Right. And those are less costly interceptions than interceptions at the line of scrimmage. And you don't vote for MVP based on interceptions. You vote for MVP based on everything.
Yeah.
Interceptions are part of everything, but they are not all of everything. So it was a hard year. There was no clear MVP, but he was, I thought, the most valuable player.
Yeah, and I didn't feel like Lamar's season in 2019 was wild, but when we start getting into the who was the first unanimous MVP? Was it Peyton in 04?
No. Brady in 11, maybe.
Brady in 11. So when we start going,
I think it was 10 that Brady won.
10?
Brady in 10. Yes.
Yeah, Rodgers won in 11.
So like that should be a special thing. And it should not have been 49-1. Like Lamar's season.
I didn't think it was going to be. I was shocked.
No. When those results came in, you were probably like, oh boy.
Oh boy. Yeah. That's what
I was expecting Purdy to get some votes, to be honest.
Yes. So here's the thing. The all pro votes come in first.
Yeah.
The all pro votes, there were 2 votes for Prescott, 2 votes for Purdy, and 1 vote for Allen. And so I thought when the MVP voting comes in,
similar.
2 votes for Prescott, 2 votes for either Purdy or McCaffrey.
Yeah.
And 1 vote for Allen. And instead, everybody who voted Purdy and Prescott first team all pro still voted for Lamar Jackson for MVP, which is weird. If you're the best quarterback in the game, if you're not the best quarterback in the game, how can you be MVP and not be first team all pro at your position? That doesn't make any sense.
I mean, and really, honestly, like, it's I get it's more ceremonious at this point, but like, how often is there going to be? There really should never be a non-quarterback to win the position.
Yes, there really should never be a non-quarterback to win MVP. That's why you have offensive and defensive player of the years for non-quarterbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I guess to finish up, because Neil kind of plugged the the Football Almanac. Where can our listeners find all your work?
Yes, FTN Fantasy is where I am now. ftnfantasy.com/DVOA is our page for DVOA and stuff. And that's where you'll find information about the book when it comes out, or on Amazon. I would show you the cover, but we haven't designed it yet. My guess is it'll have Travis Kelce on the cover because we had Mahomes on the cover last year. And because we want Taylor Swift fans to buy our book.
That's smart.
Smart marketing. No, Aaron, thank you so much again for coming on. That you were somebody you're kind of, as Steven said, Neil, you're the math guy, so you guys are going to click. I've always loved what you've done. So this is actually really, really cool for me to have gotten to talk to you.
Yeah.
And you're doing something, I think, our job, or our promise of this podcast is tell the story of the NFL. And you've been doing it for over 20 years in a really awesome way. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Good to be on. Good to be on. Glad to do it.
Thank you again to Aaron for coming on today's show. You can find all of his work at ftnfantasy.com. That's ftnfantasy.com.